Hello 99ers, and welcome back to my little Texas-shaped corner of the retro computing world, where it's time to talk about shmups on the TI-99. Vertical scrolling shooter is way less fun to say than shmup, but that's what I'm talking about. 'Cause vertical scrolling shooters are a genre that I have liked a whole lot for a long time. And if you want proof of that, the very oldest upload on this channel is me playing Aleste on my modded Game Gear several years back. But that was then, and this is now. And why put a vertical scrolling shooter on something that makes it as easy as a Game Gear does when you could make things more interesting and put it on something that makes it as tough as a TI-99 4A does instead? So today we're going to look at how well TI-99 game developers did over the years bringing vertical scrolling shooters to the TI-99. And we eventually did get everything you could ever want from a TI-99 shmup. So there's a happy ending there for sure. But why shmups? Well, besides my liking them a whole lot, right in the TI-99's heyday of the early 80s, vertical scrolling shooters like Xevious were some of the most impressive things out there in the world of video games. And in 82 and 83, whether any given system could bring the arcade hits home without making a complete mess of it was pretty much the best measuring stick for the gaming mojo of a system. But making a vertical scrolling shooter like Xevious happen on the TI-99 wasn't going to be easy, since when it comes to scrolling, the 9918 VDP doesn't do anything to make a developer's life easy. Being able to do smooth scrolling on a big detailed background is pretty much the holy grail here, though. So, machine be damned, somebody was definitely going to try it. And we did get TI-99 games with some kind of scrolling effect or other pretty much immediately, with Parsec putting on a show for 99ers in that department in 1982. Parsec's a horizontal shooter, of course, but it was the best proof of concept in its time that action gameplay and smooth scrolling could go together on a TI-99. And before the TI-99's commercial life ended in '84, we did get a couple other horizontal scrolling shooters for the system. We got Defender, we got Protector 2, and there was even work on a port of Vanguard, though sadly that one never actually got completed. Plus, edging just a little closer to an actual vertical scroll, we got Sega's Buck Rogers Planet of Zoom in late '83. Then we got Imagic's Moonsweeper in early '84 doing pretty much the same thing. Both of those are into the screen shooters, but they do scroll vertically in their own way, so progress maybe? Another popular early '80s TI-99 game that at least gives a nod to the idea of vertical scrolling is Demon Attack. That throws a nice vertical scroll between each sublevel, so, well, it's got the principle of the thing down at least. It means well, but still, not quite the real thing, and the gameplay is all fixed shooter style. So, on the whole, it was a lot of faffing about scrolling in any direction at all, except straight upwards and continuously. Until fall '84 at least, when one game actually did that. And that game was the TI-99 port of Asfile from Tiger Vision. Tiger Vision were porting a few different Orca arcade games to home systems at the time, but Aspile's the only one that saw a TI-99 release. What we got in Aspile is a Xevious clone, pretty much, so this one is a full-fledged vertical scrolling shooter mechanically, for whatever that's worth. But the catch is, it's also a psychedelic nightmare that's just not much fun to play. The visuals can be really hard on the eyes. It's like they worked to find all the ugliest color pairings available on the TI-99's 15 color palette. It's pure chromatic terrorism. But on top of the palette issues, enemies and objects blink into and out of existence willy-nilly, and when you can see them, the enemies get about 3 frames of animation a second, I'd say. Plus, if we ignore that, well, as far as the scrolling goes, which was kind of the original point here, the background just scrolls one tile at a time. so it's not even really doing that impressively. I'll settle for chunky scrolling in a great game any day, but Asfile just ain't it. In my experience, most 99ers will tell you that Asfile is pretty much unplayable. Still, it was the first TI-99 cartridge game of its kind, and that awful palette at least isn't the TI-99 version's fault, really. The original's just as hard to look at, intentionally it would seem. Doesn't really make the game any better knowing that, but it's a reason at least. Anyway, Asfile was a pretty rough start for the TI-99 vertical scrolling shooter genre, but Tiger Vision wasn't the only company with TI-99 releases scheduled for '84, of course. Data East was another company adding to the library that year, and they were adding arcade ports. Burger Time was their most popular TI-99 release in the end, but in some alternate universe, Data East would have added two shooters to the TI-99 library in '84, Astro Fighter and Mission X. Both of those are ports of vertical shooter arcade games, but, well, '83 derailed a lot of plans in the world of video games, and neither of them ever got a commercial release. The silver lining here is we have completely playable prototypes of both of them. So, while there are no cartridges to collect if that's your bag, Astro Fighter and Mission X are still TI-99 games we can enjoy today. As for Astro Fighter, it definitely isn't much of a scroller, either in the arcade version or the TI-99 one. Again, we haven't got smooth scrolling on offer, and the scroll is really just scenery. It's not targetable terrain or objects. The upshot of that being that the difference between Astro Fighter and a fixed shooter is really just a bit of window dressing in the background. It definitely beats Asfile at being a game I'm willing to play, but it's not really the scrolling shooter we're hoping to find here. Mission X, on the other hand, is a lot closer to what we're looking for. If we're in the hunt for a game that puts a Xevious-style shooter on the TI-99, then Mission X does not miss by much. Unlike Astro Fighter, this one actually has scrolling terrain and a mix of ground and air enemies. We still haven't got smooth scrolling, of course, but, well, it's an interesting formula all in all. Your main job is bombing ground enemies, and not only can you move in 2 dimensions, you can increase and decrease your altitude, which increases and decreases your speed along with it. Mission X isn't really a Xevious clone, for better or worse. It's another competing shooter doing something a little bit different. But whatever else it is, it's an honest-to-goodness vertical scrolling shooter on the TI-99. As I say though, the catch is that Astro Fighter and Mission X were both unreleased titles, so they weren't doing the average 99er a whole lot of good in 1984. And Asfile remained, sadly, the only real vertical scrolling shooter for TI-99 to receive a commercial release at the end of 1984. So, as the commercial lifespan of the TI-99 came to a close, that was the best we got. We had plenty of worthwhile horizontal scrolling shooters in Parsec, Protector 2, and Defender. We had into-the-screen shooters in Buck Rogers and Moonsweeper. But when it came to vertical scrolling, well, if you didn't like Asfile and you didn't have a disc copy of Mission X, you were pretty much out of luck. And that didn't really change until the late '80s. But it eventually did. And Cerberus is the first example I know of a community-made vertical scrolling shooter for TI-99 that really delivers the goods. The first North American mention of Cerberus I can find is from 1988, but it was from Apesoft over in Austria, and it's entirely possible it circulated there earlier, and I'm just missing the story of its origins that exists somewhere in German-language newsletters inaccessible to me. Cerberus is a simple game, but it's pretty damn slick for what it is. The attract mode especially is freaking phenomenal, with some great intro music. Always a way for a game to get on my good side. And my favorite thing about this intro is that you can take control of the ship at any point during the attract mode. You just start playing where you are immediately. So, one of the best attract modes on the TI-99. Cerberus is a short game, so it's not going to give you endless hours of gameplay, but it is a really good proof of concept at least, and it's good for a quick game now and again for me that I enjoy plenty. Plus, short though it might be, it really is a challenge. You play on easy, middle, or insane difficulty, and insane is genuinely pretty insane. Technical achievements aside, another highlight here is the Austrian-flavored English the game has on offer, which tells us that Cerberus is waiting in the hell, and says we should shout the monsters, otherwise they guzzle you. I've played enough Japanese shmups that I guess I just see broken English as a hallmark of a great shooter at this point. So no criticism there. And no serious criticism anywhere else. Cerberus was never going to be the be-all and end-all of TI-99 shmups, but it was a pretty good start for a new generation of TI-99 shooters. But nice as Cerberus was, things really took off in 1989 with Quentin Torminen's Warzone. This game is fast, and it's a proper Xevious clone as far as the basic gameplay mechanics go. Warzone and Cerberus both made fast action and responsive controls a top priority, so even if they aren't particularly stunning visually, they feel great. But yeah, visually, Warzone isn't doing a whole lot. There's no real terrain scrolling by for one thing, it's just a patterned and paletted background. But even if the window dressing isn't really there, the gameplay makes Warzone a great addition for me. It keeps things from getting monotonous by breaking up the action with boss battles, and those work pretty damn well for their own part. It's not quite Xevious, but it's definitely getting there. And the good news is, the game got where it was going a couple years later, in Warzone 2. This plays a little slower, at a speed that's a lot more like Xevious itself, and at this point, as a Xevious clone, it's way more complete. A lot more like Xevious is definitely the way I'd sum this one up. So we've got air enemies and ground turrets, but we've also now got barriers that get in our way and block our fire. Most importantly though, now we've actually got some terrain going on here, and that terrain is smooth scrolling by. With Warzone 2 in 1991, we finally got a TI-99 4A vertical scrolling shooter that ticks all the boxes. Smooth scrolling, terrain graphics, and a solid shooter design. Granted, the design's lifted wholesale from Xevious, but, well, if it works, and Warzone 2 definitely works. One upshot of Warzone 2 being way more like Xevious than Warzone 1 is that I feel like the original doesn't get outmoded by the sequel. They're both doing pretty different things that are both pretty worthwhile in their own way. Warzone 1 is fast and chaotic, while Warzone 2 is more slow and tactical. And if that's where the story of TI-99 vertical scrolling shooters ended up, it'd be a pretty happy story, I figure. But the story's not quite over yet, because a whole lot of years later, in 2018, Rasmus Mustgaard gave his final answer on what a TI-99 shooter could look like. This one's a port of Flying Shark, a 1987 arcade shooter that got ported to a whole slew of systems of that era. But, naturally, not the long-deceased TI-99. It did get a pretty solid port to ZX Spectrum, though. And that's relevant to TI-99 concerns, since the Speccy runs at the same resolution as the TI-99, and with a really similar 15-color palette. The TI-99 can do better color resolution in its backgrounds and can do hardware sprites, but that just means if you're working with Speccy assets, there's an opportunity to make them a whole lot better. And they definitely do get the TI glow-up in Rasmus's port. There's a whole lot of things to like about this game. First of all, we've got phenomenal music here. The kind of phenomenal music we tend to hear in a Rasmus game these days. that's ultimately thanks to a music player by Mike Brent, which has got the TI-99 doing the tricks that the Game Gear and Master System have done with the very same chip in those machines for some time. As a game, Flying Shark's got everything I look for in a shooter. The enemies have interesting movement patterns, the ground and air threats are dense enough to keep you pretty busy, upgrades let you increase your firepower, which always feels good, and something I really appreciate, the game lets you fire at a seriously rapid pace if you can tap fast enough. Ripping off an endless stream of projectiles in Flying Shark by tapping like a madman is just really satisfying for me. As far as difficulty goes, the levels do have a good difficulty curve, and things do get as challenging as you could ever want later on. And when things do get crazy busy on levels 3 and 4, your bombs are a great exhaustible resource for clearing large groups of enemies. And the existence of that resource adds to the game's strategy. If anyone ever manages to replace Flying Shark as the TI-99's top vertical scrolling shooter, well, God bless him. But realistically, it'll probably just be another Rasmus game if that ever happens. He can only beat himself at this point. For now, Flying Shark is just about everything I could ever ask for from a TI-99 shooter. And we've come a long way from where we started, where we kicked things off in '84 with Aspile's slow slideshow of a psychedelic nightmare. But the same year, the prototype for Mission X gave us a scrolling shooter with air and ground targets, terrain scrolling, and freedom of movement in 2 dimensions. So, '84 wasn't a complete wash. And then a few years later, Cerberus gave us a fast chase through a vertically scrolling tunnel which delivers fast action even if it isn't a long game. Then at the end of the '80s, Warzone gave us a fast responsive shooter inspired by Xevious, but definitely standing on its own as a game with a pretty different feel. After which, Warzone 2 gave us a more complex Xevious clone, giving us the terrain and the enemies and the obstacles you'd expect from Xevious, making it the most complete vertical scroller since Mission X, which then brings us to Flying Shark, as the current reigning king. So, what's next for TI-99 shooters after Flying Shark? Well, Rasmus is currently working on a Zaxxon port for TI-99 4A as I record this, and it's already a great port as it is, so that's almost certainly going to be the biggest story for TI-99 shooters in 2021. Still, the first shooter series I mentioned in this video, if only in passing, was Compile Celeste, and Rasmus's Power Strike demo shows off what Celeste would look like on the F-18A enhanced TI-99. So, maybe that could turn into a game someday? Certainly would be cool. And for that matter, I'm a massive Space Harrier fan, and it's got versions for Atari computers, MSX, Spectrum, and just about anything else at this point from that era. But not my TI-99. So, seeing Space Harrier on the TI would also be really cool. But I'll take whatever I can get, and Warzone 1 and 2 and Flying Shark are some pretty great consolation prizes at the end of the day. Thanks for watching, folks. Did I miss a vertical scrolling shooter you've run into over the years on the TI-99? Did you play Warzone back in the day? Tell me about it in the comments. And if you want to hear more from me on TI-99 history in gaming and computing in the future, hit subscribe. See you next time.